us the opening seminar, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Hello, everyone. I'm Shinji Tokonami. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I'm Shinji Tokonami, Director of Institute of Radiation Emergency Medicine, Hirosaki University. It is my great pleasure to have many distinguished participants from many countries, universities, institutes, and organizations here at this seminar. Our institute was established in 2010 as a strategic research institution at Hirosaki University. On March 11th in 2011, the Great East Japan earthquake occurred and was subsequently followed by a nuclear accident at Tokyo Electric Power Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant. We played an important role in response to the disaster and transmitted a wide range of academic information. This achievement has been highly rated not only in Japan but also internationally. In parallel, we have started a human resources development project for Nuclear Regulation Authority and other projects that aim to make us a hub institution for domestic utilization and collaborative research. Additionally, we commenced several international collaborative research projects with institutions in Asian and African countries. Also, we have enhanced our international partnership with universities and institutions in many countries such as Cameroon, China, Hungary, India, Indonesia, Ireland, Thailand, and so on. We wish to enlarge our international network, global education, and research. Therefore, the International Radiation Science Collaboration Center has been established as a part of our newly launched international training program for radiation protection. And today, we have organized the first seminar to commemorate the 10th anniversary of our institute by a series of online seminars. Firstly, we plan to invite all international collaboration guests from many countries to celebrate the 10th anniversary at Hirosaki University in Japan. Unfortunately, due to the COVID-19 pandemic, we were unable to host the 10th anniversary seminar in person. Alternatively, we are pleased to offer you a series of seminars throughout this year to share a lot of knowledge on radiation science by the experts from major countries and provide a chance for you or students to ask questions, share their research experiences, and discuss various issues facing when conducting your own research. From now, we will bring you a concentrated 1-hour session on the first lecture entitled Aspects of the Natural Radiation Environment by our dear friend, Professor James McLaughlin. He has been working at the University College Dublin in Ireland. I have known him and worked together for a long time on radon and health perspective. We believe that by joining this webinar, we are in the right space and the right time. Let's accelerate exchange of knowledge and ideas and also scaling up of good research and education network together. Finally, I wish you all a very successful webinar. Once again, thank you for your participation.
Right.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you, Professor Tokonami. Next, let us move on to today's lecture. As Professor Tokonami mentioned, the title of the lecture is Aspects of the Natural Radiation Environment. Our speaker today is Professor James McLaughlin. He and his PhD degree in physics from University College Dublin. He is a Professor Emeritus of School of Physics, University College Dublin, Ireland. Currently, he is a research professor of our institute. Moreover, In the middle of 1980s, he carried out the first national survey of indoor radon in Ireland and similar surveys in Serbia and Greece. He has also worked on the environmental and health impact of depleted uranium weapons in Serbia. He was a founding member and first president of the European Radon Association. He has been published more than 140 scientific papers and reports in the field of radon, environmental radiation, indoor air quality, and radiation protection. Now, without further ado, we will turn the time to Professor James McLaughlin. Please start your lecture, Professor McLaughlin. Please.
Okay, thank you very much, Masahiro, for that introduction. Before I start, I should tell anybody watching that this particular seminar was arranged by me to be targeting students on the training course in Hirosaki University. I know a lot of experts are going to be watching it today, so it's not aimed at the experts expecting latest research information. It is aimed at a student population at the beginning, learning about radiation and radiation protection. So, with no further ado, I shall continue. We all live in a natural radiation environment, and that goes back to the time life first appeared on the planet Earth. We're not sure when that happened, but any life that occurred there would have received radiation at a higher level than now, as it happens because of the long time ago, as uranium would have had a higher concentration, thorium, all of these long-lived materials would have been giving a higher dose at the time in the environment. But for humans, us today, from the moment we are conceived until we die, we are being exposed to natural radiation all of the time. I shall now look at the different components, and as follows. The three principal ways in which we get exposed to natural radiation are external irradiation of the body from terrestrial radiation and cosmic radiation, inhalation of natural radionuclides in the air, and of course, ingestion of natural radionuclides in foods and liquids. This is summarized here in this particular slide, in which you can see the different components, but mainly the two big ones, of course, are terrestrial radionuclides and then the cosmic radiation. And the terrestrial radionuclides, both by internal and external exposure, are dominated by potassium-40 and members of the uranium and thorium series. And of course, the main ones there, in the case of the uranium series, would be the doses due to inhalation, mainly from radon and its progeny. And its progeny, as we'll see later, such as polonium-218 and 214, are alpha emitters, and therefore potentially they can do a lot of damage to DNA molecules. Some of you may have seen this type of chart before. It's prepared by Unscare, which shows globally the estimated contributions to public exposure coming from both natural and artificial sources. 80% of the doses we receive are from natural sources. And if you look at the right-hand side, the natural sources are dominated by this is the average worldwide assessment, are dominated by radon, including thoron. And you can see the other components there: cosmic radiation, terrestrial radiation, and ingestion. These are of natural radionuclides. Okay, now you can further break that down if you wish, and you can see, for example, that the contribution, short of a major accident, the contribution from the nuclear fuel cycle is quite low on this scale. Okay, now radioactivity was first discovered by Antoine Becquerel, or as he's also called Pierre. And that was in 1896. And it's interesting that he discovered radioactivity when he was doing some work which involved uranium salts. So the first discovery of radioactivity was not artificial radioactivity, but it was natural. And then there was a flurry of research work in the following decade or so, in which people began to find evidence of radioactivity in the environment in many, many sources. One I particularly like is the discovery of natural radioactivity in the air. This was carried out by two school teachers, actually, Julius Elster and Hans Geitel in Germany between 1902 and 1904. They had been investigating atmospheric electricity and other phenomena that were quite interested in the scientific world at that time. And they did a very simple experiment. They hung up a wire in the open air and applied a negative potential of 1 kilovolt to the wire and collected some substances from the air onto the wire. And then they rolled up the wire and they first cleaned the wire, and they cleaned it with a leather cleaning pad, and they made an auto radiograph using a photographic plate of the leather cleaning pad, and they found the characteristic tracks that would form from radiation on it. So they identified the radiation coming from the air by means of auto radiography. So that was quite a breakthrough in a sense that we discovered that there was radioactivity in the air as well as coming from the ground. Now, back in 1904, you see here on the left of the screen, and I hope you can all hear me properly, you see on the left of the screen the front page from an issue of a journal called Le Radium, which was published in April 1904 in France, of course. And you see this old gentleman there with some apparatus. The large metal object on the ground was collecting what they called emanation, or as we would call it, radon and thoron, emanating from the ground. And it looks like he's taking a sample as well for analysis. And you'll notice there's a wire running from the top of it, which I presume was connected to some form of electrometer that was measuring the ionization of the air inside that chamber. And this procedure of looking at radon, for example, in soil continues to this day. In an area in which you're exploring for uranium. And it's a good indicator if you've got a very high anomaly in a particular point that there's a source below which is producing the radon. And therefore useful to the geophysicists looking for uranium deposits. I have two pictures there. One is showing a colleague of mine, George Reynolds, who's a geophysicist, collecting, this was back in the 1980s, exploration for radon or uranium was going on in Ireland, and George was using emanometry in the sense that he was drawing air into Lucas cells, which are small zinc sulfide chambers, and then he would measure the alpha activity using photomultiplier and associated electronics. And more recently, he was working out in the Sahara Desert. This is a picture of a colleague of his doing something similar in Mauritania. So it continues. People are interested in measuring the radon from soils. Now, I hope you can see all of this. I'll just make a slight break from physics back into biology. As you know, in the 19th century, Charles Darwin developed his theory of evolution by natural selection. And he calculated that it was such a slow process, it would need hundreds, if not thousands of millions of years for his theory to actually produce these changes in biological species that he was investigating. And at the same time, geologists also discovered that geological processes were taking place at a very slow rate on planet Earth. And both Charles Darwin and the geologists like Lyell at the time reckoned that the Earth must be perhaps hundreds, if not thousands of millions of years old for these processes to take place. However, at that time, people believed that the Earth was only a few thousand, 6,000 years old. In fact, William Shakespeare, in his play As You Like It, refers to the poor world is almost 6,000 years old. Now, where that number comes from, actually, is from a Dubliner. It was James Ussher, who was Archbishop of Armagh and Primate of Ireland in the Anglican community, not in the Catholic community, Anglican community, and he was professor also in Trinity College, and he was a biblical scholar, and he calculated from the evidence in the Old Testament, the Bible, that the actual, he calculated precisely the day and the time at which the Earth was formed 6,000 years ago. And that got into most English printed Bibles to this day. In fact, some of them still have it. And as you probably know, a substantial percentage of the present United States population, particularly people who supported Donald Trump, I think, believe that the world is only 6,000 years old and that the geological and biological information is, of course, fake news. But to be serious, back in the mid-19th century, William Thomson, who was actually also born in Ireland in Belfast and later became Lord Kelvin, he was one of the best physicists of the 19th century. And he did very, very precise thermodynamic calculations, starting with the concept of the Earth being a molten sphere and gradually cooling. He reckoned the Earth was only about 100 million years old. And in fact, he later reduced that estimate down to about 20 million to 40 million years. So in fact, poor Darwin was distracted and disturbed much more by Thomson's estimates, which were too short for his theory, than by the objections of religious fundamentalists. And of course, Henri Becquerel came to the rescue in 1896 when he discovered natural radioactivity. And that led to people like Lord Rutherford in England and other scientists at the time calculating that the natural radioactivity of the Earth was a source of heat that Kelvin didn't know about. And therefore, the Earth was they worked out the Earth was, for instance, Rutherford worked out that the Earth might be 1.6 billion years old, which was quite fine for Darwin. He vindicated, if you like, validated Darwin's idea and the geological ideas. The actual figure of 1.6 billion years, of course, is not correct. And nowadays we estimate it's much older at maybe 4.5 billion years. Unfortunately, poor Darwin died in 1892, I think, before radioactivity was discovered. So he never lived long enough to see his theory validated by natural radioactivity. And an interesting historical point is that Darwin, Lord Kelvin, and Rutherford, and even Bishop Ussher was buried in the same cathedral, in Westminster Cathedral. And I'm sure they're having very interesting discussions nowadays, if that's possible. This dispute between Darwin and Kelvin, which was solved ultimately by the discovery of natural radioactivity, was called the Battle of the Beards. And Darwin was very upset about Lord Kelvin's view because he respected him enormously. And there's a letter from Darwin to Wallace, who independently discovered evolution by natural selection. He was working out in Indonesia at the time. That Lord Kelvin's views on the recent age of the Earth have been for some time one of my sorest troubles. So poor Darwin, but he was vindicated or validated in the end. Now, just before I leave this, a lot of people have done calculations on the changes in background radiation on planet Earth and changes in atmospheric oxygen levels over these periods from its beginning. And Andy Karam and Leslie published this graph here in 1999, which shows the radiation dose from natural radiation on the Earth from years ago, from its beginnings back at 4 or 4.5 billion years to the present time. And you can see that it was gradually decreasing. Now, the biggest decrease, in fact, is what's known or shown here as the biological decrease, which really represents essentially the decay of potassium-40 in the organisms at the time. And we are full of potassium-40, not full of it, but we have potassium-40, but at a much lower level than organisms would have had at the beginning of life. But and oxygen, of course, as the oxygen levels go up, you have a combination of background radiation and increasing oxygen levels, which gives rise to radiogenic DNA damage rates. So the role of background radiation, which is a term I don't particularly like, but certainly the role of it combined with oxygen may have played an important role in the way we have evolved. All living species have evolved over geological time. Now, cosmic radiation is one of the main forms of radiation that we deal with coming from outside. It's a natural radiation, and the history of that is interesting. The history of its discovery is interesting. As I indicated, people like Elster and Geitel and people like that were quite interested in the atmospheric electricity at ground level, and one way that they calculate or measure that was to measure the ions produced in the air at ground level and up mountains, etc. And this is a typical figure. I think it was these measurements were made in Paris by Bricard and Pradel in 1966. Air radioactivity, the total number of ion pairs per cubic centimeter per second is about 10. This would be a typical sea level European value even today, of which about 40 to 50% would be produced by alpha emitters, natural alpha emitters in the air. And you can see the other components and ground radioactivity. And at the top, you see cosmic radiation. However, at the time of the beginning of the 20th century, cosmic radiation wasn't known about. And the person who definitively discovered it, there were other scientists who had found indications that there was radiation coming from above, particularly in the attack. But the person who actually discovered the radioactivity of the cosmic radiation, not the radioactivity of cosmic radiation, but the radiation itself, was Victor Hess. Now, Victor Hess in 1912 went up in a balloon, and as he went up in the balloon, he was measuring the air ionization using an electroscope. You see here on the right of the picture. Now, as he went up, this diagram here shows that as he went up in his balloon, the ionization, as he expected, in the air decreased for about the first kilometer. But after the first kilometer, it gradually increased. And you can see here, I think he went up to about 5 kilometers, which is quite a brave thing to do, considering his balloon was probably filled with hydrogen or coal gas, which was a very dangerous bit of experimenting. But he found that there was no doubt that the higher you went, the more ionization was occurring. Now, he came to the obvious conclusion that it wasn't radiation from the Earth anymore. That fell off in the first kilometer. It was radiation from above. And that was the discovery of cosmic radiation, for which he was eventually awarded the Nobel Prize in the 1930s. As you probably know from what I've just been saying anyway, the higher you go up, the more cosmic radiation dose is received. And this chart here shows going from sea level up to, for instance, La Paz, which is a city in Bolivia. The cosmic radiation continually increases with altitude, as Hess showed us. And of course, if you get on an aircraft and travel long distance or even short distances and go higher again, you will find the radiation level increases even further. And we expect with supersonic flight, you would be much higher and again, higher cosmic radiation. So cosmic radiation obviously increases, the dose from it increases the higher up you go. Now, this diagram here shows us that the cosmic radiation, for instance, this is flights between New York City and Europe and Frankfurt, showing that the variation of the radiation dose from cosmic radiation correlates very, very closely with the frequency of sunspots. Now, sunspots are indicative of activity, solar activity on the sun, and it causes a lot of disturbances of magnetic fields, etc. And when there's a very high maximum of sunspot activity on the moon and on the sun, and the next maximum will occur in July. The estimate in July 2025. There will be such strong magnetic field disturbances which will give a protective barrier to the Earth from And then on the other hand, if we went back to the last sunspot minimum, which was in December 2019, approximately 2 years ago or a year and a half ago, you will find that the cosmic ray value was correlated with that in the other direction. And the sun has an 11-year cycle. So there's this up and down change with the sunspots, which are well known for people who travel or measure in aircraft the cosmic ray doses. There's nothing new in that, but it's interesting. Now, I just tried to get together some information on how this affects normal air crew. And in my own country, as a member of the European Union, our radiation protection regulations ultimately are traceable to the European Union basic safety standards. And basically, it requires our authorities, our regulatory authorities, to identify air crew likely to receive between 1 and 6 millisieverts of cosmic radiation in any 12-month period. And if they find that the routes they're picking and the duration of the route flying is likely to receive doses in excess of 1 millisievert in any 12-month period, then the operating company must inform the air crew and maintain records, etc. And special provisions are for female air crew when they declare pregnancy. So there's special protection there both for the mother and the fetus. And of course, if they go over 6 millisieverts, then they become classified. For instance, the pilots or the cabin crew, they become classified as category A workers, which required forms of medical supervision and record keeping, etc. Fortunately, the flying hours are also controlled by, if you like, trade union regulations. IATA, the International Agency for Air Industry, limits the number of hours pilots can fly, for example. And of course, as you'd expect, the highest doses would be obtained by high-flying aircraft for long haul, mainly transpolar flights, because in the transpolar regions, as distinct from the equator, you get a higher cosmic ray dose from the concentration of the cosmic radiation in the polar regions by the Earth's magnetic field, whereas in the equator, it's much lower. So depending on the route and the altitude and the time of flying, the doses can vary quite a bit. And of course, we expect with future long-haul flights at supersonic speeds and higher altitudes, the dose will increase again. But this is under regulation by the companies and both the European and Europe, the European Basic Safety Standards, and internationally, the IAEA safety standards. Okay, now we are living in an age when people leave the Earth, or have been leaving the Earth for a number of years, going up to the moon back in the 1960s and 70s. And then more recently, we have had such extraterrestrial activity as people living on the International Space Station. And for example, here, the Apollo missions and the Skylab missions, we estimate that the astronauts were getting maybe 1.2 to 1.4 millisieverts per day from cosmic radiation. And for instance, in a year, if you stayed on the International Space Station for a year, you would get 150 millisieverts per year. Now, we have been talking, or it is a popular discussion point, and NASA and the European Space Agency and other international agencies are planning perhaps to send people to Mars. Now, on the way to Mars, excluding solar flares, which are a problem you cannot control for, even on normal conditions, it's estimated, and it is also has been measured actually in unmanned probes, that the dose inside a spacecraft en route to Mars would be about 1.8 millisieverts per day, which is similar enough to Apollo and Skylab missions. And then on the surface of Mars, it drops to maybe 0.6, 0.7 millisieverts per day, depending on what part of Mars you land on. Again, verified with unmanned craft that have landed on Mars. Now, if we take an estimated mission to Mars consisting of a transit time of 180 days, and you have to get back again, so it'll be 180 by 2 days travel, and let us say, after going to all that trouble, they stay on Mars for a substantial length of time, maybe about a year and a half. In that situation, any of the astronauts who did a trip like that and came back safely would be getting close to, in this particular calculation, 980 millisieverts, or almost a sievert. Now, we shall see. I probably won't be alive to see it happening. Some of you, I would hope, would be. Now, we all know about astronauts. For instance, the Apollo astronauts have reported strange optical phenomena. That is to say that some of the early Apollo astronauts reported eventually that they had flashes in the eye. And they didn't want to report it initially, but on their route to the moon and back again, it is now well known that flashes in the eye occur. Now, they didn't report it at the time because they were afraid that NASA would say, oh, there's something wrong with your vision is impaired, you have problems in your brain perhaps, we're not putting you on any more flights. But in fact, we now know that it was cosmic rays stimulating either the visual cortex or more likely the vitreous humor in the eye, causing flashes of light. Now, before we come to an experiment I want to tell you about, when cosmic rays hit the atmosphere, of course, the primary cosmic rays cause secondary interactions, as illustrated here, which with all sorts of particles being produced, pions, mesons, gamma rays, etc., as a result of the interaction of the cosmic rays with the atmosphere. And at ground level, this up to high altitudes, it shows you the proportion of the doses associated with these secondary cosmic radiation fluxes in the air. You can see muons and protons, etc., neutrons, and their relative contributions. You'll see the muon contribution at ground level is higher than the others. Now, a colleague of mine, well, I was a student at the time when he did these experiments initially, Neil Porter in my university in Dublin, I'm retired, but my former university, University College Dublin, he and a psychologist did a very interesting experiment before the Apollo missions. I emphasize that point, in which they set up an experiment with human volunteers, and this diagram shows the situation. Now, this is a schematic diagram. It's not to scale. It's just indicative. You had a human volunteer lay down, sandwiched with their head sandwiched between two Geiger tubes, and the Geiger tubes were connected to a twofold coincidence circuit, and the output from that was fed into various recording devices, both giving an audible signal and electrical signal. And the human observer went into a dark room. It was a photographic laboratory in the university, which was totally dark, and they got acclimatized to the dark for perhaps a half an hour, and then the experiment started. And basically, if a flash occurred in their eye, they recorded that either by pressing a button or saying yes or no or whatever. And at the same time, there was an almost identical piece of equipment nearby with no human observer between a bank of Geiger tubes, which also recorded. And when they compared the, we call the positives, that they detected a flash in their eye or sensed a flash in their eye, as a function of the coincidences coming out the end there of the coincidence circuit, they got a correlation which was above, it was significant, I think at about the 4% level, which indicated that a process was taking place, that there was a correlation between the flux of cosmic rays, muons, through the two Geiger tubes and the human observation of a flash. Now, they proposed possible mechanisms. The three possible mechanisms for the flash in the eye from the muons are indicated here. One is that Cherenkov radiation was occurring in the vitreous humor of the eye. That's the liquid inside the eye. And the other one is that perhaps scintillations were occurring in the crystalline lens of the eye. And another possibility would be direct excitation of the retina. Now, excluded from that is something you might say, how about the visual cortex? But in fact, the geometry of this experiment was done so precisely that it was only muons coming in a very narrow angular window that targeted the eye on the side of the head and didn't go to the visual cortex. So that possibility was excluded. I remember as a student myself, later on, a few years later, volunteering to take part in such an experiment. And you would sit in the dark for about an hour and you would count maybe 100 flashes in your eye and see how they correlated with the electronic detections of muons going through your eye. It's an interesting experiment. Maybe people still do it at a student level, but it would be worth, I think, setting up a student experiment somewhere to do that again with modern electronics and modern detectors. Now, terrestrial radiation, getting down to ground level from cosmic radiation, comes from the rocks and the geology surrounding us, and from materials derived from that, such as building materials that we make our houses from. And this diagram here, which is taken from a new atlas that has been produced by the European Union, a Joint Research Centre in Ispra, shows you just an indication of what I'm talking about. As I say, terrestrial radiation from surroundings largely is reflecting the local geology. And this is a map showing Germany in this atlas of natural radiation. And it shows, for example, variations. The blue values are very low and the darker red, brown colors are higher. And on this particular map, you can see that the range of external radiation levels ranges from maybe 20 to 100 microsieverts per hour, depending where you are. High values there, you'll notice, to the in Austria, to the west of Vienna, and some in Germany as well. And then in the north, on the north coast of Germany, where the geology is not as radioactive and there are no mountains, you'll see that the level is lower again. So wherever you are on planet Earth, depending on the local geology, you will find external radiation doses of varying amounts. And of course, the building materials, as I said, derived from these geologies will also reflect that. Now, there are places on the planet which have been found to have high natural background radiation. There are, for instance, the four best known ones, not the only ones, but the four best known ones are as follows. There's an area in Ramsar on the Caspian Sea in the north of Iran, which I visited myself 10 years ago for the IAEA. And there's Kerala in India, Yangjiang in China, and Guarapari in Brazil. All of these areas, because of the local geology, have enhanced natural radiation levels. And of course, there's no standard definition of what a high background radiation area is, but I would imagine if you were in an area where the external radiation was giving you a dose of 20 millisieverts per year, that to me would be a reasonable operational definition for a high background radiation area. As I say, I went on a mission for the IAEA about 10 years ago and went to Ramsar, a very nice part of the country, beautiful actually, very fertile land, etc. And here's a radioactive spring, high in radium, a very high radium content in Ramsar. And at that point, we measured dose rates as high as 33 or 34 microsieverts per hour. Now, I would let you know that the global mean is about 40 nanosieverts per hour. So that's quite high on the global scale, the external radiation. And we visited a house in Ramsar owned by a teacher, and the highest spot in the house had a dose rate of 108 microsieverts per hour, which scales up to an annual dose at this measuring point of 946 millisieverts. Now, of course, nobody stands at that point on the wall for a whole year, but it's indicative of the fact that the building materials derived from the area can also contribute substantially to doses in houses built of the building materials. And because of the radium content in this particular area, in the building materials derived from local geology, you got a lot of radon. You get high radon gas levels in this area too. But the interesting point is that the local population doesn't seem to be suffering any noticeable radiation-related illnesses. There are chromosome aberration studies that have been made to show that radiation is causing them, but the general health is excellent in the area. So, but that's someone else's task to do that in more detail. Now, getting back to the environment we're living in, this diagram here shows us the different exposure pathways from food, be it land-based food from animals and vegetables, in which uptakes radionuclides into the food, or from the sea or rivers where fish concentrate natural radionuclides. And of course, we have cosmic radiation and inhalation we've seen before. So there are many pathways by which we get radiation doses. And of course, once you're inside our house, we will have radon levels coming up from the ground, contributing most of the dose we're going to get from natural radionuclides. And this is a little bit more detail, but it's the same idea that you have various foodstuffs contributing to doses to the humans who consume them. This table here shows us the two largest, or the two main natural radionuclide sources of dose in the human body, excluding radon and thoron. I'll deal with that separately. And the two main ones are, well, ones of interest at least, are doses from potassium-40 and also from carbon-14. Now, the biggest one, of course, of these two is potassium-40. Now, potassium-40 has a half-life of about 1.28 billion years, and it's a tiny fraction of potassium. Most potassium in your body, which is an essential component to human existence, most potassium is potassium-39, which is not radioactive. But if you eat a banana, for example, you can calculate that a typical banana will give you a dose of 0.1 microsieverts. If you stuff yourself with 50 bananas, you will get a dose comparable to a dental X-ray, and maybe thousands of bananas would give you a dose equivalent to a CAT scan or some other high dose situation. Of course, that's ridiculous. Nobody does that. But one banana, 0.1 of a microsievert is a useful indicator. Now, when you consume any potassium-containing food, you cannot overdose yourself with potassium 40 because the body in equilibrium is reached, the metabolic equilibrium is reached in the body. So any excess potassium 40 you comes in your diet will be excreted rather than assumed. But under typical conditions, a 70 kilogram adult actually has a body activity going on inside them of 5,000 becquerels. In other words, there are 5,000 emissions of radiation from potassium 40 per second going on in your body. And that results over the year in a dose here calculated to be 0.165 millisieverts. Carbon 14, on the other hand, which is a cosmic ray produced radionuclide in the atmosphere, it's a neutron proton interaction to going from nitrogen to carbon 14. It gives rise in your diet to giving you a dose of much lower 0.012 millisievert. But the human body is emitting radiation from carbon 14 in your body, giving about 2,700 becquerels or emissions per second in the body. So we're radioactive ourselves, right? Now, one of the principal decay chains of interest in natural radiation, of course, is in the environment, is the uranium series. And if you go down the uranium series, you get to radium-226. And radium-226, which is a half-life of about 1,600 years, is the immediate parent of radon. And then radon, which is a half-life of about 3.82 days, radon will decay into a series of short-lived radio nuclides or progeny. Most notable of, for our purposes here this morning, is, or this morning, my part of the world at least, is polonium, or our polonium-218 and 214. And polonium-218 and 214, which I'll refer to again, respectively emit alpha particles. And alpha particles are very, very damaging. Alpha particles can give rise to double-strand breaks in DNA molecules. They also can produce a lot of free radicals in the liquids of the body, which are predominantly water. So alpha particles are quite nasty internally to accumulate in your body compared to an alpha source outside your body. You can protect yourself easily from an alpha sources outside your body, but once they get inside, they deliver their energy over short ranges in human tissue between about 50 and 70 micrometers, and could do quite a lot of damage. And these are ones we'll be coming back to. But the actual main radionuclides, like the uranium itself and the thorium, etc., they get into the food chain, but the committed doses are relatively low. They're up to some tens of microsieverts at most, the annual committed effective dose. So they are detectable, and people measure them and keep a control on foodstuffs and etc., so that we don't overdose ourselves with any of these things. And there are very, very strict regulations about radium in drinking water, etc., which there should be, of course. But in most cases, the doses are not that significant. I refer to building materials, and for example, building materials in the European Union basic safety standards, they have an index for primordial radionuclides in building materials. It's a form of screening. It's an index I, which relates to the gamma radiation and doses from gamma radiation in excess of typical outdoor exposures in a building constructed from a given material. And an index of 1 can be used as a screening tool for identifying materials likely to cause the reference level, European Union reference level for external radiation to be exceeded. You can see it's made up of 3 contributions. The contribution from radium-226, the thorium-232, and also, again, our friend potassium-40. So it's just a screening level that can be used to identify materials in buildings that cause problems. I mean, a famous example many years ago occurred in Sweden when very high radon levels were found in Swedish houses. And this was due to the extensive use at the time of a substance called alum shale, which was quite high in radium-226. And it not only produced high levels of radon in the house, but presumably also the external radiation in these houses was higher than was comfortable. So it's a useful way of protecting the population. Now I get to radon and thoron. Now, radon and thoron, which is an area I'm quite familiar with, radon itself, as far back as 1988, the World Health Organization Cancer Research Agency, known as IARC, the International Agency for Research on Cancer, classified radon as a Group 1 human carcinogen. Now, this was based, of course, on extensive epidemiological studies of underground miners, not all uranium, but mainly uranium miners in different parts of the world, that it was quite obvious that the exposure to high levels of radon gave rise to an increased risk of lung cancer. So radon was identified as a Group 1 human carcinogen at that stage. Of course, in fact, it's more the radon decay products are the real nasties in this topic, as we'll see in a moment. And then the World Health Organization had a major project this century going on. Back in the beginning, the World Health Organization International Radon Project. And when that was completed and a very nice handbook was produced, it was estimated at that time that globally the proportion of lung cancers attributable to radon ranged from 3% to 14%, depending on the radon levels in the houses in different parts of the world. Now, this figure is liable to differ, as I indicate, from country to country. And recently, a couple of years ago, I came across a report in Environmental Health Perspectives in which an estimate had been made based on the radon surveys in 66 countries. And the estimate was that between about 13 and 16% of lung cancers could have been caused by radon, attributable to radon. Now, the attributable to radon idea is quite complicated because obviously, and it has been shown as well, was that it's a much bigger risk from radon if you're a smoker. So there's an interaction, a synergism between smoking and radon, which really is behind a lot of these figures. But be that as it may, and taking into account uncertainties in all of these estimations, nevertheless, this calculation by Gaskin et al. Estimated that for these populations in these 66 countries in 2012, perhaps greater than 200,000 deaths could be caused by radon exposures. Or if you like, the other way around, there would be 200,000 less deaths if there was no radon. Okay. Now, as I said before, radon's decay products, the alpha emitters, the two ones, polonium-218 and 214, are the prime worries when you inhale radon's decay products, because they're short-lived, they deposit in the lung, and they deliver their alpha particles to sensitive cells in the lung. And similarly with thoron and its decay products, except that there's still a lot of work to be done on thoron. And I should mention here that the group led by Professor Tokonami in Hirosaki University has a well-deserved international reputation for thoron studies, developing detectors to measure thoron as decay products, and also measuring thoron and calibrating thoron detectors. They have an exposure chamber for calibrating radon and thoron decay products. So there's quite an active interest and experience in Nagasaki University in the Tokonami group in this area. And this is illustrated here in this diagram here, which shows starting on the left. I hope all of you can see what I'm seeing, but starting on the left, you have what we call them traditional radon gas detectors. All of these detectors, by the way, the sensitive material for detecting the presence of radon or decay products is a plastic material called CR39, Columbia resin 39, and it's an alpha track detector. So you can see it to the left. You can see here on the left of the picture a little, what looks like a little bit of plexiglass or perspex, and that is the radon, that is the CR39, and you expose these detectors, they're closed, you expose them in a house or a workplace for many months, up to a year perhaps, and then you etch and you measure the tracks that are produced. Now in the middle here, you can see a dual detector called Raduet, which is commercially produced by a Raduet in Hungary. But the background to the development of that, detector here, which detects radon and thoron, is in Hirosaki University. And also on the right-hand side here, you can see what is called radon progeny deposition monitor, which is CR39 with a series of absorbers over it so that it can distinguish between the alpha particles from polonium-218 and 214. The higher energy one gets through some of the absorbers and the lower energy one doesn't. So in fact, from a difference methodology, you can work out the relative contributions of deposition by these two particular alpha emitters. And at the bottom there, it shows part of the preparation for a project I carried out jointly with Professor Tokonami's group in Ireland when we made up these detector holders which measured and put them in houses. You can see here on the right, put in hanging from a wall, which measured radon gas, thoron gas, and the deposition of radon progeny. And we did that in about 250 houses, if I recall. So there are ways that we can keep an eye on the thoron progeny and radon situation together at the same time. This graph or this table, which you probably can't really see to detail, I won't go into it, shows the results of various surveys that took place in Europe over the years for radon, ranging from average values as low as 20 becquerels per cubic meter of radon in the United Kingdom. That reflects largely the low radon levels in the London area. It's a population average, up to places like the Czech Republic and Finland, where over 100 becquerels per cubic meter is the mean value. And of course, indoor radon levels are distributed log normally, with this shows a typical log normal distribution with a reference value there of 200 becquerels per cubic meter, which is a typical reference value in many countries. They deposit when you inhale them. I'm going quickly now because I don't want to go too long and bore you too much. So the human respiratory tract, the main target area in this for the inhalation of radon decay products is the bronchial region, and depending on the size of particles you inhale, whether it's radon decay products or otherwise, any particle you inhale into your lungs, it'll deposit by various mechanisms depending on its size in different parts of the respiratory tract. And the bronchial region, you get a lot of deposition of very, very small particles, submicron sized particles. And for instance, Justin Porsendorfer did some very, very good work in Germany on measuring the size distribution of radon decay products. The old name here, radium A, refers to polonium-218, and the radium C or C dash is the polonium-214. And it's a bimodal distribution with the smaller particles, which we call unattached radon progeny, down around a couple of nanometers, and then the others at a couple of hundred nanometers, or up in the micrometer range. So when you inhale, you're inhaling essentially two types of radon decay products in size terms. And when they deposit in the bronchial epithelium. And on this diagram here, taken from Beer 4, you can see that it's an idealized diagram, that if the activity lands in the mucus area of the lung, then a lot of what we believe the sensitive target cells to be are shown here as these large black dots. They are within alpha particle range of the alpha particles from the radon decay product, whether the emission occurs into deposit material or material that has migrated into the lung tissue deeper. But it's well within range, and doses can be calculated. So there are various dose models. I haven't got time to go into the details, but obviously you need to know the breathing rate that you're breathing, and the activity size distribution, and the particle deposition mechanisms in the airwaves. And also, very importantly, there's a process of particle clearance from the airways, the mucociliary escalator, if you like, that brings up activity that's deposited in the mucus. And then you need to have good information on the depth distribution and the identification of the target cells within the bronchial epithelium. And various models are applied. As I say, I don't have time to do them. But this diagram here gives us an idea of the two approaches then to calculate the risk. There's the approach where you go through a somewhat complicated process of using models to end up calculating a dose, or you go directly using epidemiology to find out what the risk is from radon. So the two main routes are the epidemiological route and the dosimetry route. And in Europe, for example, Sarah Darby from Oxford University coordinated a major definitive European residential case control study where over 7,000 cases of lung cancer and 14,000 matched controls were studied in terms of their exposure to radon, their smoking habits, their age, and other factors. And this very, very thorough study, and there are similar ones that have taken place in other countries. In the United States, for example, there have been similar types of studies. And they all show that as the radon level increases, the excess or the relative risk, and of course the excess relative risk increases. In the case of with radon concentration, in the case of this study, the overall, if you can announce a single figure for such a complicated series of studies, in this particular study, the overall principal finding was a 0.16 or a 16% increase in the excess relative risk per 100 becquerels per cubic meter. And there was no evidence of a threshold or that the excess relative risk varied with age, sex, or smoking history. Now, we're not talking here about absolute risk, we're talking about excess relative risk. That is to say, obviously, people who smoke have higher absolute risks, but the excess relative risk as a function of radon concentration that they're exposed to didn't show any or didn't vary as a result of their age or their sex or their smoking history. Perhaps this is an easier way of looking at it, expressing the results in terms of the cumulative risk, the cumulative lifetime risk, I think to age 75, if I remember correctly. You can see there quite clearly that if you take two cohorts within that group who are continually smoking and those that have never smoked in their life, in both cases, the risk increases with radon exposure. But in the case of the smokers, it increases quite dramatically. As you can see there, the figures are self-explanatory. And of course, people who give up smoking, you can always reduce your cumulative risk if you stop smoking at any stage in your life, you'll be somewhere in between these two graphs. So, and as I indicated earlier, quite a number of basic safety standards, the EU basic safety standards and the IAEA one also recommends reference levels for radon. And for instance, in the European basic safety standards, which is incorporated into law in the European Union, the national reference level in air shall not, this is in homes, for example, and normal workplaces, shall not exceed 300 becquerels per cubic meter. Now, that's not a target. It's just a limit that you don't go above. In fact, most countries in Europe have a national reference level around 200 becquerels per cubic meter. And the World Health Organization considers a reference level of as low as 100 becquerels per cubic meter will be justified, and that it shouldn't exceed 300 also. And that's equivalent here to, stated to be equivalent to 10 millisieverts per year. But I would raise a note of caution on that final comment there about the 10 millisieverts per year. There has been a lot of changes and controversy in recent years over how do you convert from essentially from a radon measurement, a radon concentration to millisieverts. And you go through a process and you come up with something called a dose conversion factor. And there has been a lot of controversy, which I won't go into now, about what is the appropriate dose conversion factor. A recent ICRP report, 137, I think, has recommended various approaches to calculating the dose from the inhalation of radon decay products. And that's a topic that's developing. Right, I more or less, I've overshot the time a little bit. Sorry about that. I hope you could hear me throughout all of this. And thank you for your attention, those of you who are still listening, that is. And again, I'll hand you back now to the chairman, Masahiro, Dr. Hosada. So thank you very much. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Professor James McLaughlin, for your excellent lectures. So now next, we will go ahead and take some time for questions. Just a reminder, please be sure to type your question into the chat box in your control panel. Okay, we have many questions. So
I'm sure you have.
Yes, Jim. So
Yes.
One question from Indonesian colleagues. If we want to be safe, how long is the maximum per month or per year we can safely fly by airplane, especially for pregnant people?
Would you repeat that? I'm not sure exactly what the question is saying. Just repeat it again, please, Masahiro.
Okay. So, question from Indonesian colleague. If we want to be safe, how long is the maximum per month or per year we can safely fly by airplane, especially for pregnant people?
Oh,
do you have something information?
Well, I mean, at the moment, nobody's flying very much anyway. But in fact, I don't even like that word safe. At any radiation dose, there's a risk. But for example, I know that pilots are restricted to maybe about 600 flying hours per year, some figure like that. So I don't think individual people need to worry about safe or unsafe travel by air. I mean, it's a question. There is really no simple answer to it.
Yes, I know.
It's not no. Like a typical businessman traveling maybe 30 or 40 times a year, long distance flying. I mean, for example, I think between London and Tokyo, on average, you get about 50, I think about 50 microsieverts. So it would take a lot of flights even to get up to a millisievert.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. So I
So,
don't think you have to worry too much. So any
yeah,
other question? Sorry if that doesn't answer the question, but that's a quick
yeah.
view anyway.
So,
Yeah, okay.
do you know, do your country have a guidance level or a reference level for aircraft?
For what?
For difference level or guidance level?
For aircraft?
Aircraft.
Well, I said, for example, that we conform to the European Basic Safety Standards. And if any air crew, be they male or female, cabin crew or pilots, if they're likely to exceed 1 millisievert per year, then that's recorded and an eye is kept upon it. And if they're long distance ones, even more so. And if they go over 6 millisieverts per year, as I said, then they become category A workers with all that requires in terms of medical surveillance, etc. But it rarely happens. Okay?
Yes, thank you very much. So the second question from Japanese graduate students. Thank you for your great lecture. I heard that the unscare will not adapt the dose conversion factor reported by ICRP. What do you think about it? Should we use the new dose conversion factor or not?
Well, as I tried to indicate at the end, and this is almost a political question that I don't like to answer, but I believe in the science. So UNSCEAR also believes in science, and of course, so does ICRP. We all do, scientific evidence. And UNSCEAR is continually reviewing the evidence. And up to now, up to 2 years ago, the most recent UNSCEAR report to the UN decided to stay with the old dose conversion factor from its, I think it's 2008 report, in the sense that they weren't disagreeing with anyone, but they were saying the evidence still has to be evaluated. So they're not saying we recommend you must take the old value, but they're not prepared to recommend a change in what they had already. I hope I've given that correctly. But I personally feel that for members of the public, exposure to members of the public, which I'm more interested in than in occupational exposure, I think we should be operating and driven by the findings of epidemiology, direct epidemiology, rather than going the dose conversion route. It's different within the framework of ICRP protection procedures for people who are occupationally exposed. There's a whole framework that they have to operate through. But for the general public, I would think myself that, if possible, the evidence from appropriate epidemiological studies should be, rather than going along the dose conversion route. Okay?
Yeah, thank you very much. Another question from Hungarian colleagues. Thank you for the presentation. Could you tell us your opinion on the risk of low dose radiation? The hormesis effect and the linear non-threshold models?
Sorry, would you just repeat that last part?
Okay.
Yeah.
Could you tell us your opinion on the risk of low dose radiation? The hormesis effect and the linear non-threshold models?
I got the hormesis effect, and what's the last point?
I
heard you.
Yes. What is the position? Yes, you believe the hormesis effect or linear non-threshold models?
Oh, right, yeah. Again,
your opinion, please.
There are two schools of thought about this. I mean, the hormesis effect it gives us the idea of a beneficial effect from low dose radiation. But again, it's rather like all of these studies to deal with health. The evidence, I am not saying for one moment that hormesis is wrong, but the evidence, I think we have evidence of a risk, for instance, like lung cancer in radon, down to low levels below, down to, we'll say, 100 becquerels per cubic meter. Now, there may be a beneficial effect from radiation below that, but it's safer to adopt a linear unless the evidence is completely conflicts with it, it's safer to adopt a linear no threshold model, right? But again, this is a semi-political question.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So we have many questions. So Dr. Tadoe, do we have a time for the question discussion?
Two more, is it? Two more questions?
Patrick is okay, but maybe two more questions. Not like
Okay. So we must choose. So yes, question from Indonesian colleagues. So thank you very much for your interesting presentation. For biodosimetry, which one more efficient at damaging DNA, such as causing chromosome aberration, external radiation from photons, or internal radiations?
Okay, well, I'm not a radiobiologist. I'm not. I'm a physicist.
Yes, I know.
And I'm always very reluctant to make comments about radiobiology because it's a very, very complicated business with respect to the the various contributors to radiation damage, both direct damage to DNA molecules by radiation and the indirect effect, which is probably more common, where the radiation produces free radicals in biological tissue, which can also attack DNA and cause mutations and what have you. But as I say, I'm not a radiobiologist, but I do know that damage, direct damage and indirect damage to DNA molecules is brought about by radiation. So yeah, I think that questioner would need to talk to a radiobiologist to get
yes, of course, I think so. Yes.
Yeah.
Excuse me for that. So, and several information from Peter Boschu, and
yes,
of
Peter.
course, some information from Bachin from IAEA. Of course, so many people send greetings to you. Okay, maybe yes. So I have a very simple question to you. So today, as you know, and many students and young colleagues are attending this seminar. So if you agree, would you please introduce us why you have choose natural radiation environment for your research field?
Why I adopted that?
Yeah, why you have interesting about natural radiation environment?
Well, you want to know why I got involved in this field, yeah?
Yes.
Yeah, okay, well, many years ago, when I was a research student, my first project, I was working with Professor P.J. Nolan, who was a student of Rutherford. And he and I were working on projects dealing with atmospheric electricity, ionization in the air. And as I referred to earlier, the main source at ground level is coming from alpha emitters and to a lesser extent from cosmic radiation. And that led naturally into the main cause of ionization at ground level was from the radon series. So I got involved in radon. But actually, I should make a comment that your listeners might be interested in. I referred to these interesting experiments in the 60s in which optical effects were detected in the human eye from cosmic radiation muons. But in fact, my old mentor, Professor Nolan, told me that when he was working with Rutherford told him that one of the criteria that Rutherford applied to accept a research student if they had good eyesight, because as you know, Rutherford did pioneering work on and virtually invented the alpha particle. He detected alpha particles, and the detection method then was looking down a microscope at a zinc sulfide screen and counting the scintillations coming from the zinc sulfide. We still use it in Lucas cells, etc. And if the potential research student didn't have good enough eyesight to see the zinc sulfide scintillations down the microscope, he wouldn't take them on. Now, that's an anecdote from the old days, for over 100 years ago, but I thought it's interesting. that we didn't have photomultiplier tubes and such like in those days. So you had to rely on the human observer. So we should never dismiss the human observer. Okay.
Yeah.
So
Thank you very much.
Does that answer your question more or less?
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah. Oh,
yes.
okay.
So it looks like we covered all of our questions. Professor James McLaughlin, is there anything else you want to tell us?
No, the only thing I want to say is that we are living in a terrible time at the moment, and with the COVID, and we all hope and we all want to stay safe, and people should continually practice social distancing, irrespective of whether we get vaccinated or not. We should continue with social distancing and hygiene, etc. I mean, there was a certain reluctance to admit that COVID was a big problem, particularly in the United States under the previous presidency, shall we say. But now things are beginning to move in the right direction. Actually, I should make a final comment about this, is that earlier on in my lecture, I referred to the 6,000-year-old Earth and how religious fundamentalists still believe that. And in fact, I know that a substantial fraction of the supporters of the previous US President, Donald Trump, would fall into that category, which was a great pity. But I would say to my old friends that are listening to me and everyone else, delighted to have this opportunity, at least for you to hear me. And I look forward to all of us meeting in the real world sometime in the future. And in the meantime, stay safe. Stay safe. And thank you very much for your attention.
Yep. Thank you very much.
Yeah, you and I, Masahiro, will keep in contact on this afterwards.
Yep. Yes, sure. Yes.
So are we signing off now, yeah?
Yeah, please wait a moment. Yes, great.
Okay.
Thank you very much, everyone. So we appreciate you being here. Next, for your information, as we will organize a series of online seminars to celebrate the 10th anniversary of our institute. Thus, we may set up the next seminar in April 2021. Thanks again for joining us today, and we will see you in next time. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for a very interesting
Thank you.
lecture.
Thank you. Bye, James.
Thank
Bye,
you
everyone.
very much.
Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot.
For the presentation.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Yeah, thank you for this interesting seminar or lecture. Really interesting and new information as well. Yeah.
Bye.